Ok, shalom lekulam y bienvenidos. Hoy tenemos con nosotros una académica estrella, es una invitada especial desde Israel. Es uno de los vicepresidentes de la Universidad Ben Gurion, Mikhal Bar-Asher Siegal, y que realmente tiene de hecho un enfoque bastante especial para nosotros en sus estudios. Es la relación que hay entre los escritos rabínicos y los escritos cristianos, algo que por lo menos en este lado del mundo es bastante raro de ver. Conmigo hoy está también Alexander, que le estaremos entrevistando, así que auguramos un excelente capítulo. Mikhal, welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for being here with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a professor of Rabbinic Judaism, which means that I deal with the literature that was created by Jews in the first century CE. Specifically, I'm a scholar of Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, which is, the Jews are called the people of the book. This is a name that they were named by the Quran, and it meant the Bible. But the real honest truth is that the Jews are actually the most influenced until this very day by a different book. This is the Babylonian Talmud that was redacted in modern day Iran and Iraq around the 6th or 7th century, but by the 11th century is codified as the most important book for legal matters for Jews who want to keep Jewish tradition. And it goes all the way to modern day Israel, where people still marry, still get buried, still get divorced according to this text. So this is my text. This is what I do. On a personal note, I'll say that the fact that I'm telling you that I am, as a woman, studying this text is actually new and could not have happened 100 years ago or so. Women were not, I grew up Orthodox. I wasn't allowed to study this text when I was little, when I was growing up. And even when I came back I wrote my dissertation at Yale University and did my postdoc at Harvard. And when I came back to Israel to teach Talmud, I doubled the number of female Talmudists in Israel. There was one, and now we were two. So this is a new phenomenon that women and non-Jews study this text and actually bring in new questions and new perspective into this text. And I'm very proud to be part of that. And specifically, when I look at this text, the question I ask are questions about the relationship between Jews and Christians in this text. And what is this seminal text, the most important text for Jewish culture, no doubt, what does it have to tell us? Because it has sources in it contained. It's an anthology of many views of rabbis from different geographical areas, from different time period, going back from the 1st century CE all the way to the 6th century CE. What can it tell us about Jews and Christian in those formative first centuries that formed Christianity in its earliest stages and Rabbinic Judaism at the same time? And my research found out that this text, in fact, has a lot to tell us about that. So that's what I do. And I live in Jerusalem and with my family. And I teach at Ben Gurion University of the Negev, which is in the south of Israel.
Great. And I know that for our audience, as you were telling us, who are you? There will be some interest on why a Jewish scholar is interested in Christianity and Christian texts.
So that's actually a very interesting question. It has to do with the scholarship of this literature. So when the modern study of religion, both Christianity and Judaism, started in the 19th century, like the critical study of religion, it was started by people who believed this text to be sacred. So the first scholars of Christianity were Protestants from Western Europe that looked at those texts. Same thing happened with Rabbinic Judaism. This was men, Orthodox Jewish men from Western Europe that looked at those texts. And they looked at it from inside. They were very much, concerned with the text from within as their faith tradition. So they were looking at it critically, but from their faith tradition. This actually influenced the question that scholars asked about this, the default assumption of some of those texts. Personally, I grew up and I studied Talmud in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the Faculty for Jewish Studies, taught by Jews and obviously all men. And I was studying this through those texts, and I did my BA and then my MA, and I was about to start my PhD. And then at some point we traveled to Harvard because my husband was doing his PhD and I was studying there as well. And then at some point I raised my head and I said, I'm about to write my PhD and I know nothing about the non-Jewish world of the time of the rabbis. Nothing. I barely read the New Testament, didn't know anything about Christianity, or not to speak of monastics and Gnostics and Asian religion and Islamic, nothing. This was how I was brought up. I got a very good training in philology. This is early 21st century, but I got a very good training in philology, but almost nothing about the non-Jewish world. And this is why I went outside of Israel, went to Yale and studied my PhD there. There, the Jewish Studies department is actually located within the Religious Studies department, not Jewish Studies. And I sat in classes next to students who studied Christianity, students who studied, Islamic the traditions and Buddhism and monasticism and Gnosticism. And we were all sitting together in class in Religious Studies. And all of a sudden, by the way, this is how I chose my classes. I opened the course catalog. I'm old enough to remember actual course catalog that was actually a physical book. And I remember opening it and saying, okay, I want to do from 2nd century to 6th century, everything that's not Jewish. So I did, architecture in Rome, and I did bathing rituals in the ancient world, all kinds of stuff that was from that time. And I remember sitting, and this is the first semester at Yale, and I sat in a monastic class about the monks, Christian monks, and I studied from scratch. I didn't know any of this stuff. And I was reading, this is first semester at Yale, and I'm reading texts about monks, and I'm reading one after another. I'm like, this is very familiar to me. I know this stuff. This sounds so in dialogue with what I know from the rabbis. And I was completely shocked because that went against everything I was taught about the rabbis. There was, I was taught that in the Babylonian Talmud, there was no connection to Christianity. This is in the Persian Empire. There were no Christians around. There were no connection. And all of a sudden, I'm reading this text and they are clearly in dialogue. I'll give you an example. I'm reading this text about a monk living in a cave and fighting his demon, and he's drinking from a miraculous fountain and eating carobs or dates from a tree and talking to Elijah, whatever, all this stuff. And I'm like, wait, we have that story too in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This is like the most famous scholar that then becomes the centerpiece for the Zohar, which is later become the Kabbalah movement. And this guy is sitting in a cave with his son studying Torah and, feeding from a miraculous tree and miraculous fountain and talking to Elijah. And even the content of what he's saying is criticizing people for working the land by saying, how are you forsaking eternal life, study, for temporal life, work? And we have the same exact sentence said, with the monks and Mount Sinai. And I'm reading this and like, wow, this is obviously in conversation talking about asceticism and study and all of this notions and theology. And it was mind blowing. I don't know if I can even describe what I was going through in my first semester, meeting this like non-Jewish world at the time of the rabbis and realizing that they were not in a void, they were not out of context, there was a world of theology around them that they were clearly in conversation with and in context with, and that was like this like mind-blowing moment that I found my topic for my first book, which was about the monks and the Talmud. And then when it went on to continue, but by the way, it was extremely scary at this point to publish this and express this and say the rabbis were thinking with Christian materials. They were influenced sometimes by Christian theology, where they were like in dialogue with this. Very scary, to publish that first book. But I'm actually very fortunate that, the tide has shifted. And in the past, I would say 20 years, I'm fortunate that my work is now consensus and people do realize that rabbis and Christians were very much in conversation, and it's evidence there. We just have to start looking and reading it with that mind frame in mind.
And who do you think influenced the other, the rabbis to the Christians or the Christians to the...
Both.
Okay.
Both. Very much so. So for my field, the revelation was that it went that way too. So the rabbis were, so we always have this like imagery, and even the church in the 60s, they the Judaism as the roots, and then Christianity continues that along the way. The problem is that the sources we have don't work with that scheme, because the earliest sources we have from that time period are the New Testament sources. The rabbinic sources we have only start from the end of the 2nd century. So in fact, Paul's letters, the 50s, are the earlier sources we have, and then the New Testament gospel at the end of the 1st century. And only then we have the earliest rabbinic sources. So if you're looking at it, in fact, rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity, the earliest church fathers, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, 2nd century church fathers, they're the same times as the early rabbis. So in fact, when we're looking at Judaism and Christianity, the Judaism from which they both came from is biblical Judaism, and it's very different from later rabbinic Judaism, which in fact developed side by side early Christianity. So the two are like developing side by side, and therefore we have to ask who influenced who talked to who. And when you look at the sources, and not on this like linear but actually horizontal line, and you're saying, wow, they were in conversation with each other, and we can see this in the sources. So in the Christian sources, it's kind of easy to say, because Justin Martyr talks to a Jew, and Augustine talks with a Jew, and we have the Chrysostomus yelling at his audience in the 4th century, stop fasting with the Jews on Yom Kippur, and stop going to their synagogue. And we have church laws from Spain, Elvira in the 4th century saying stop taking matzahs from the Jews on Passover, and stop, so we know that Jews and Christians were in contact in the Christian sources. My research is new to bringing into the picture and saying it's also happening in the other direction as well. The rabbis are looking at monks all around them with their theology, and they're saying, wait, maybe this asceticism thing is interesting to us too. Abstinence from sex, that's something we might want to think about. Or repentance, or prayer, or, there's so many, when we're looking at Jews and Christians, we often tend to go to the easy route. We look for Jesus in the Talmud, Jesus stories in the Talmud, or, Mary, or Christianity. But religion, or religious life, as any religious person in modern day knows, that the theology or the dogmatics of the religion is one part, but religious life has a lot that is in common to all religion. How does one repent? How does one deal with sexual desires? How does one deal with, suffering? These are human questions across the board. And the rabbis were looking at Christians of their time and asking, wait, can we think about what they're suggesting and think about it? And we don't even have to think about it using Christian, but bring it in. Let's talk about a rabbi sitting in a cave and suffering or whatever. Let's talk about our repentant robber. Let's talk about our, repentant whore. And let's think about all this through using Jewish thinking. That's one avenue. The other avenue, which you haven't mentioned yet, is biblical interpretation. Because don't forget, Jews and Christians in the 1st century CE all the way now have a shared text, the Bible. So how do you read? Well, I mean the Old Testament, obviously, but how do you read the Old Testament? And they're both asking those questions, and they both have very similar, question when you're looking at the biblical text. So sometimes the text is difficult to understand. Sometimes we suggest certain interpretation. The status of the Holy Spirit, the relationship with the fathers of the nation, Isaiah, the eschatology, all kinds of stuff like that are found in the Old Testament. They're all looking at the same text and they're asking very similar question. Were they aware of what the other community was doing with the same text? My answer, yes, they were. We know that from the Christian sources, and we know that what I'm saying also from the Jewish sources. So that, and this was a very long answer to your very short question, to say that in fact we found out that the relationship between Jews and Christians was much more enmeshed and in contact than we previously thought.
Yes, yes. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about that combination and that symbiotic relationship because within New Testament and Christian origins, which is where I work in, you do have a paradigm that has been accepted and it's been propagated for years, talking about the parting of the ways, which is basically that idea of the division between both religions, so to say. So I wonder how your research and how specifically that understanding of the sources and how your first book challenges or fits within the parting of the ways concept.
Yeah, so actually my work, and again, I had to say that this has, so my own reckoning and my own understanding that I need to study about the non-Jewish world is not disconnected from the fact that, you know, that the rest of the scholarly work has gone through a shift. The first and major shift is that the study of Christianity also realized that there were very Western looking, facing West, and the study of Eastern Christianity was poorly and criminally neglected through centuries, and only in the past 20 years or so has been, you know, living through a revival of publishing Syriac texts and looking at Eastern Christianity. We still have a long way to go, Manichaean text, and even this is, you know, still needs a lot of work still to happen. And we in Jewish studies enjoyed that revival, right? So we're taking that. That's one shift. The second shift is once we start looking at the text more carefully, both East and West in Christianity and in rabbinic literature, we realize that the metaphor of the parting of the way suggests that there was one way, and at some point and at some moment in time there was such a moment first, and second, from that moment on we have two ways that parted. They're very defined and they are very parted. Everything we know about those texts suggests the exact opposite. You know, first of all, what is the original way that was? Was it the biblical way? What is the first one? We know Second Temple period was, as the masterpiece of Life of Brian has taught us in Monty Python, that the Second Temple period was filled with, you know, groups, Jewish groups, and many theologies and sects, you know, fighting. So what was the one way that we're talking about? Second, the moment of separation. What moment of separation? Usually people put this around the beginning of the 2nd century, around the Bar Kokhba revolt. And it aligns well, by the way, with the fact that for the first time we found terms such as Christianity in writings such as Ignatius, saying you cannot practice both, be Jewish and Christian at the same time. There is no such thing. So people say, wow, look, beginning of the 2nd century, we have something that's called Christianity, and that's where the parting of the ways happened. That's one way of calling it. But by the way, the fact that Ignatius is yelling at his audience, you cannot be both Christians and Jewish, means that his audience thought you could, right? So that wasn't the moment of separation, even though, you know, you start envisioning terms to describe this new, that's true. You're using new terms such as Christianity and Christian. But the situation on the ground was very far removed from that rhetoric. So we have to differentiate between the people talking about rhetoric of separation, which is true, that might work with some kind of a separate parting of the ways, and the reality on the ground. So you're catching me at a kind of like a joyous moment, because I just finished my 3rd book, seriously, 2 weeks ago. And that's thank you. It's an experiment. It's actually the first time I'm writing a book that is popular. And I'm trying to describe this world of first 600 years of Jews and Christians. A story. I'm telling a story. This doesn't have footnotes on it, and it's very hard to write without footnotes. So it's like a very popular book with, you know, at the end of the chapter, additional reading material, suggested material, but otherwise a very like a story because I realized that if you want to understand the story, you have to go look for scholars who studied about, Justin and the Jews, or you have to do Talmud and the Christianity, but you don't have a story telling the whole arc. So that's what I just wrote. And I called it, It's Complicated. That's the name of my book. But in this, I suggested this metaphor, and I said, I call it the bus sticker rule. The bus sticker rule is this. You know how, I know, in Israel, we have, in the buses, we have the front row is like two seats, one facing another. You have this in trains as well. I don't know if your country has that too. And in Israel, those two seats, one facing the other, there's a sticker there that says, do not put your feet on the seat in front of you. That's in Israel. By the way, I went to the US and I just came back from Germany. There's no stickers like that. It's in Israel. So what do we learn from the existence of that sticker? I call it the bus sticker rule. So the first thing we learn is that the bus authorities doesn't want you to put your feet on the seats in front of you because it's going to dirty the seats, right? Very clear. But we also learned a second thing. From the existence of that sticker on the bus, what can we learn? That there are people putting their feet on the seat in front of them. Otherwise, why would you need a sticker? And again, the United States doesn't have that, and Germany doesn't have that. I just came back from a train ride in Germany, doesn't have those stickers. So we also learn from the existence of the sticker, this is what I call the bus sticker rule, we learn that there's the authorities who want you not to put your seat, and we also learn that people do put their feet on the seat in front of them. Taking that bus sticker rule and applying it to Ignatius in the 2nd century, we say when he's yelling at his audience, you cannot be both a Christian and a Jew in the beginning of the 2nd century. We learn that he wants this to be a separation. He wants the parting of the ways in the beginning of the 2nd century, which is an important statement to make. But we also learn that if he's yelling at that, the bus sticker rule teaches us that on the ground, there were people who thought you could in the 2nd century. So the bus sticker rule teaches us that the parting of the ways on the ground was, as the title of my new book suggests, was complicated. Things were never simple. And by the way, once they were like separated, that we have Christians and the Jews, what does it mean to be Jewish then? What does it mean to be Christian then? How many groups of Christianity had? Some of them, kept lunar calendars. Some of them didn't. Some of them kept Sabbath. We have, Christian groups keeping that until much. So all of this is like, what does it mean to be Christian? Even if you call yourself Christian, but you still celebrate with the Jews their celebration. And as Cristianos is talking to his audience, are they Christians? Are they Jews? What does that mean? They have a self-definition as Christian, but their praxis is close. So again, a very short and very long answer to your question. The parting of the ways, the metaphor of the parting of the ways doesn't work in any sense of the word, of the sense, but it does suggest to us that there were people who wanted to describe it as such, that there was a moment in history where they parted, but the reality on the ground was much more complicated than that. And my own research is actually a part of that, my own actual academic journey is part of that new revelation of research, that things on the ground are much more complicated than we thought.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And in one of your articles, I research on orality, especially because I work on oral Bible translation with indigenous community that don't have a written tradition. And I found really important for our work to describe what is the tradition, what role play orality in the formation of a text, but at the same time, what role play orality in the transmission of ideas and doctrine for the Christians and the Jews. And some people, because I call it the bubble of literacy in some way encapsulated, and the only way to keep the fixing of the text, and that's really complicated. That's another really complicated text. Like even the writing text is not fixed, but they think that the only way to fix the text, the ideas, the doctrines, are in written. And in one of your articles, you discuss these shared anxieties between Jews and Christians regarding the preservation of traditions, and surprisingly, one of the ways to keep the tradition is orality. How can you tell our audience what role orality play in the transmission of ideas for rabbinic Judaism in the first centuries of our era?
Okay. So in any case, about orality. Orality is super critical and important for Rabbinic Judaism for the very simple reason that they consider themselves an oral tradition. Rabbinic literature, I'm always very jealous of the situation for early Christianity scholars because they have manuscript from the 4th, 5th century, an actual manuscript of church fathers from that very, very close to the time of their, composing of those texts in the 4th and the 5th century. I don't have that in rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature was transmitted orally until very, very late. So even texts that were composed in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, and 5th century, the earliest manuscript we have are from the early medieval time, 11th, 12th century. And we have some Gnizah fragments, some fragments that even date a little bit earlier than that 10th century or something like that, maybe 9th, but it's very late, much, much later than the composition of the text. So we're 1,000 or 800 years later than the time of the composition of those texts. So we're dealing with an oral tradition that was transmitted orally and for a very long time. What does that mean for the text itself is very, very interesting. Does it mean that the texts were, preserved better? Did it mean that people felt at liberty to change it? Does that mean that it developed? By the time we get to manuscript, we have manuscript variation that could have been related to the fact that it was transmitted orally for a while. What does it mean about the Bible? Since the Bible was not transmitted orally, but in written. So the difference, we have this concept of a dual Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah. So we have the written one, which is the Bible, the Old Testament, and an interpretation that has to be kept oral. So the rabbis from their inception have this concept of interpretation as a lived oral tradition. And when we read it in manuscript and in text, kind of give up on that concept because we're reading it in text and imagine it differently. So this is a very, very interesting topic. And by the way, was treated about 15 years ago, there was a revival of this orality in rabbinic literature that really paid attention to that and focused on that. So we had a few scholars discuss that. For me, the angle that was interesting is that when I compared between Judaism and Christianity, how does that work? So when one text is writing its material and one is oral, what does the interaction between them do? And also, if we're looking at the concept of anthologies, right? Collecting sources from different places, oral, and then at some point writing them down. So most of the church fathers, right, you have an author that's writing something, and we can find, we know who the author is, and we know what, who wrote what, and it's so a single author. But even within Christianity, and this is where monastic literature, for example, comes in, we have collection of anthologies, such as Sayings of the Desert Fathers, and they were oral, and they were collected later. So I dealt a little bit about what would that make when we do the comparison between rabbinic literature and that? What would that look like? So I think that part of the conversation we're talking about actually talks about different sets of questions of rhetoric, of tradition and how it's kept, of kinds of interpretation and kind of connection to the text in later generation, and how you read something. When you read something in text that was originally oral, what does it do to your perception of the text and how it's written? But there's even in the comparison between Judaism and Christianity on that angle, we have interesting points of contact. And this is what I've tried to look at. When we look at monastic literature, for example, that becomes interesting, right? An ontology of text from that. So yes. In a nutshell, yes, morality is super important.
Nice. And I think Fausto is the one who's always going to ask you about the Jewish and the Hebrew Bible questions, but I'm the one who's always going to go back and take you to the other side of the New Testament, because that's how it's going to go to.
Go for it.
But I'm thinking to something that you previously said about the role of the Second Temple Judaism, and also how you've been talking about how your research pushes how people see and how people interpret these sources. And in New Testament studies, we lived something similar in the past century with E.P. Sanders, who basically kind of challenged the way that New Testament scholars were trying to understand these Jewish sources and how they might have imposed a Lutheran perspective on ancient texts. So I wonder, from your experience and expertise in rabbinic texts and in Judaism in general, what are warnings, similar warnings that you'd offer Christian readers or Christian scholars, which you have seen in the New Testament history of interpretation, that you think would be similar to that of E.P. Sanders in the past? Like some things that you could say, yeah, but E.P. Sanders didn't finish there. What are other myths you would say that needs to be bursted in this part of the world and this field specifically?
It's a wonderful question. I actually have a course I teach in my department in Jewish thought at Ben-Gurion University, which is methods in the study of religion and its implication in the study of rabbinic literature. And all the methods I'm teaching are basically borrowed from religious studies. The early scholars of religious studies were all, Rudolf Otto, a Protestant Christian, right? This is where we're starting, and we're taking their Albright when he was like, or Morgan Smith when they were like, they were Morton Smith, sorry, when they were warning us from all kinds of stuff. Or the epithet for me, he's not a Christian, but the study of religion, J.Z. Smith, right? So I'm taking all those warnings and bringing them to rabbinic literature. They're very similar. So we have, first of all, look at the context of the text, right, and not focus from the text from within. You have to understand it in context. This is something that we both, scholars of both religion, had to learn to do that, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the warning signs of parallelomania. Don't, go crazy with those, comparison and analogies and, find similarities in everything. And this obviously is a polemics to that, when it's like, it's who, obviously to who. And right, obviously you have to be very, very careful with what you do with that. Third, I would really focus very, very highly on Rudolf Otto's, Holy Other, and J.Z. Smith's warning of being very, very careful of defining one text as unique in comparison to others, and putting, uniqueness brings, we've really learned this, that when a scholar comes in from a faith tradition and puts his text as unique and basically assigning value to difference, our text doesn't do that, while those do, right? So all those Protestant scholars who were, looking down on Catholic, Christianity, as scholars saying, oh no, they destroyed the original, gospel. Same thing with Judaism. Looking at our text, rabbinic Judaism is unique because it doesn't do blah, 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 blah. Or Judaism is unique in never having done, I'm just, one scholar, a friend of mine, Dov Weiss, is writing about hell in Judaism. So you have sentences like that. Judaism don't do hell. We don't have the concept that this is a very Christian concept, right? Very looking at it again, always in the sense of superiority. Well, rabbinic Judaism have a lot of hell in it, and it's all over the place. You just have to know what to look for and whatever, because, just deciding that one tradition is better, unique than other, but in fact saying that it's better than the other is more primitive or whatever. So this is kind of thing. Another aspect that we've learned to do in terms of methodologies, we've learned from Christian studies, is the quest for historical Jesus, right? Looking at sources and thinking that they represent a historical reality, even though they were redacted much, much, much later, looking at them as if they're portraying a historical reality of a much earlier time. Scholars of rabbinic Judaism are still, just like scholars of historical Jesus, are still doing the same. Sorry, I'm a skeptic. I do not think that this is possible, but people still think that you can date rabbinic sources by the rabbi mentioned in that text, even though, if a rabbi so-and-so said so-and-so, and he lived in Palestine in the 2nd century, but his saying remained to us in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Persian Empire, in the 4th, 5th, 6th century. I'm sorry, I don't think that they represent the 2nd century, rabbinic, Palestinian rabbi. And we still have here in the land of Israel, we still have an actual academic posts for the search for historical rabbinic Judaism based on these assumptions. So we have those pitfalls in methodology that are very similar to the study of early Christianity. So this is just a few examples of how much we can learn from E.P. Sanders, but others as well, and looking at all those questions, methodological question of how to do comparison of religion, how to do critical study of religion in an age when we're already much wiser about the pitfalls and the dangers of doing scholarship through faith, outlooks.
No, so in the end, it all comes down to having an honest methodology to some degree.
Yeah, it's not only honest, I would say, we also learned that, being objective is basically impossible, but being much more conscious of our biases, I would say, right? This is what we're looking for, saying, definitely the fact that I'm Jewish and I'm Israeli and I'm a woman and that influenced the question I ask about the text. This is for sure, but at least be aware of the fact and not, and try to combat those biases by, trying to widen our field. And that represents a different kind of scholarship than other kinds of scholarship.
Yes. And now that I have your New Testament before Fausto takes you away from me, as you know, there's also a different movement for the past maybe 2 decades within New Testament scholarship. That's the within Judaism trend that's basically trying to understand this text that we have within the historical reality of first century Judaism. And I think they're to some degree indebted a lot to what Sanders did earlier, but they're trying to, I would say, move their ideas a little bit further than that. I wonder what you would think as a scholar, as a historian of early Judaism and rabbinic Judaism in general, of good and bad examples of Christians or New Testament scholars doing within Judaism readings. What do you think about the enterprise at all? Maybe
this is definitely a very good example for the pendulum swinging. So obviously, this is what we call the post-Shoah, post-Holocaust interpretation. In the 60s and the 70s, all of a sudden, people said, up until Second World War, I would say the scholarship was very much situating Jesus and Paul within its Greco-Roman context. Very, very much so, right? They're looking at it to that. I think after the Holocaust, especially in America, there is a revival of saying, wait, we've really missed the point on the Jewish aspect of it. And then they switch sides and they go so far off, Paul as being a very kosher rabbi and Jesus being there's no difference between Jesus and Paul and the Jews of their time, blah, blah, blah. And then they kind of erase the message of early Christianity as opposed to Judaism by highlighting the similarities, which are definitely there. No one, I think, denies now the Jewish context of Jesus in the Gospels, but still, the pendulum is swift so far off the other side, which, by the way, also leads to, and again, I think it comes from a very nice place, right? Also, it even comes to praxis in faith traditions that try to revive the Passover meal and do Passover Seder with Jewish tradition, but doing it in churches and then. But then, we have a pushback. Some people feel that it's appropriation, but some people think, this is like, reclaiming Jesus and whatever, because sometimes it does feel a little bit. We always have to be very, very critical of our assumption. There's, what was Jesus doing different than Jews of his time? What his interpreters thought different of his time, and being very clear. By the way, the differences between the New Testament and then second century Christianity in that aspect, at least in terms of the awareness and the place where the texts come from is clear, right? Because early Christian texts in the second century already declare themselves so the way they see themselves as something that is outside of its Jewish milieu, which is not the case in first century text. But again, everything has to be in measure, right? Everything has to be within some kind of understanding that even though we're reading the text a certain way, we have to be aware of its Jewish milieu, but also of its uniqueness that led ultimately to a group of people declaring themselves Christians and not Jews. And this is something that still needs to be acknowledged. the fact that we don't like the parting of the ways metaphor, no one's denying that by the 2nd century, people call themselves by a different name. So what does that mean? And that needs acknowledgement too. So in what ways does it mean that they're different, right? So this is definitely something we have to balance all the time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that.
And let's talk about Talmud, because that was
We
We were saying New Testament, Old Testament, and now we're Talmud. Okay, good.
well, that was initial interest, because the relationship of Talmud and Christianity. But we have to be organic in this conversation. I think we should do more podcasts with you, maybe in the next year or so, because you're busy. But what benefits do you think?
Please.
A scholar, a Christian reader gain from engaging with studying the Talmud? And what insights or value does it offer to a Christian scholar?
Wonderful. First of all, yes, invite me again, and we'll do a whole chapter on Talmud. This is definitely needed. But I'll just very, very shortly to say, the study of Christianity and the Talmud is extremely, but I have to say personally, I've been very warmly greeted by scholars of Christianity around the world. I just came back from 2 weeks at Bonn University, and the Protestant theology department invited me to come for 2 weeks, and they were extremely eager to hear about Talmud. And the reason is that studying Christianity and the Talmud offers first and foremost, knowledge and information about the interaction between the two religions. So both scholars of Judaism and scholars of Christianity get to learn from a whole new set of texts about the spread of traditions in a new area, the historical development of Jews and Christians side by side. So the Talmud offers a whole new set of texts that teaches us about Jews and Christians of the 1st century CE and their interaction between them. But it's more than that. For scholars of rabbinics, to study Christianity means to better understand the Talmud. You understand the text better once you know the Christian background. You actually understand what some of the texts, which were completely unclear before, mean if you have the Christian background. But for scholars of Christianity, the benefits are also there. So let me just give a few examples. The first one, when in my first book about monasticism, I actually had a scholar of monks invite me to a conference because he said, I was dealing a lot with the sayings of the Desert Fathers, the Apophthegmata Patrum, and he's like, wow, we don't know enough about the spread of those traditions in the early years of this collection, and now you've given us a whole new geographical area and a whole new community that if they know those texts and quotes them, brand new information about the spread of Apophthegmata Patrum. Very cool, right? The Talmud is now a source for the study of monasticism. But more than that, if the Talmud knows about for example, this is one of the examples I bring in my second book about the disagreement in the 4th century about the nature of the Holy Spirit, its divinity or not, which is an argument that happens in early Christianity in the 4th and 5th century. And the Talmud knows that and interacts with that. Think about what it means. It means we have a source in rabbinic literature that talks about that argument. So that gives us a whole new dimension to a theological debate that's happening in early Christianity, but looking at it from a rabbinic side. So that talks about the spread of that controversy and a position, a third position regarding the two opinions about the status of the Holy Spirit, biblical interpretation. So in fact, what I'm trying to say is that the comparative study of Talmud and Christianity has benefits to both scholars of both religions, and obviously scholars of the relationship between the two of them, but also for each religion on its own place.
And for a Christian scholar that knows nothing about Talmud, where do you recommend to start?
I didn't hear your question because you were cut off twice. Can you repeat that?
Okay, for a Christian scholar that maybe someone
Now
is
he's gone.
And it's thinking like, I want to start reading the Talmud. What would be a good point to start with?
I think I understood the question, even though you were lacking. Alexander, help me out here. I think he was asking if a scholar of Christianity wants to start to study the Talmud, where should he start? Right? Is that a good
Exactly.
question? Okay.
Yes, I think that's the question.
First of all, there were the few very good compendium for introduction to Talmud that came out in recent years. I would highly recommend my third book, which I just finished, talking about Jews and Christians in the first century CE. Let me plug in my new book. But if you really want to understand the Talmud, there is a few interesting, introductions to Talmud and a few I myself wrote an introduction to Rabbinic Judaism in one anthology, one such anthology. If you want, I can send it to you and you can paste the link to your readers. If you do that, there's a few very good resources that have been published in recent years to kind of make it more available. But more importantly, we now have an online translations of the Talmud that are freely available in a website called Sefaria, which I'm a huge fan of, which bought the rights to the translation of the Talmud into English. And that's a very, very approachable site that you can actually look at. You have the Hebrew text and the English translation right next to it, an interpretation of it. So anyone can start read the text directly online, and it's freely available. So I highly recommend that. What else? Lectures. There's a few lectures online I myself give. You can look at me up online and talk about Jews and Christians. And there's a few other scholars who do that as well. And be careful. There's a lot of people who talk from a faith position, which are don't do Talmud critically. I would be very careful with that, because this is not good scholarship about the Talmud. But if you look for scholars, then there's a few good resources on YouTube for good lectures that I would highly recommend.
Yeah, if you can send us a link, we can post the link in the comments in this podcast. For our audience,
Perfect. I'll send you a few links.
Yeah, for our audience too, in Sefaria they have the Daf Yomi, which is a one-page sort of the Talmud every day. You can go there and have the translation in English. And I think they're working in the translation, or they getting the rights for the translation in Spanish too, since our audience.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
Well,
So
I love Sefaria, I have to say.
Sefaria is, I told them when they started working on it, I was in contact. They know I'm a huge fan of them, because they contact me and they said, we're hesitant because some scholars think that this is, not critical. And I'm like, no, this is amazing. You're gonna this is, and by the way, I bring them every time I teach at Yale. I'm a visiting professor at Yale from time to time. Every time I teach at the Yale Divinity, I bring the Sefaria people, because it's mostly for Jewish audiences. But I say, no, you don't understand that your biggest audience are Christian scholars who want to use the Talmud, who don't know how. And Sefaria allows access to it. And for me, I have to tell you, there's a few Rubicons, there's a few milestones in the study of religion, and I think Sefaria is one of them. I'm a huge fan of them, and they know that I say that all the time. Is that I think really making the Talmud accessible to non-experts, which means non-Jews, women, people who don't speak Hebrew, even Jews who don't speak Hebrew or Aramaic. That's a breakthrough. Seriously, an incredible theological breakthrough by allowing access to those texts to people who couldn't. And I think this is going to make our world much richer and wonderful in terms of the study of religion.
yeah, just a couple last question, because we're over the time we asked you to commit, and we were really thankful for your time. It's late in Israel, so it's by 11 p.m. at this time when we are recording. But you mentioned the women and Talmud relation. Is there a tension there in some ways?
Yeah, so I mentioned my own biography that women were not allowed traditionally to study those texts. I grew up in a faith tradition that did not allow me to study the Talmud. The first time I read the Talmud was when I was 19. So I grew up in that faith tradition. And that goes back to the text itself. This text was composed by men, for men, talking about things that men care about. And it's a very male text. By the way, not unique. Christian texts of the time look exactly the same. They're also written by men for men, dealing with things that men care about. The problem begins when those texts become sacred and they are kept as sacred and authoritative for the modern world as well, where we think the status of women has changed from how women were thought of then. And then that created tension. I actually live in a country where we have parties, religious parties that run for parliament who do not allow women to run for parliament. This is 2025, and I live in a modern liberal country when there are parties who do not allow women to run for parliament. And that's based on those texts who see women as inferior and cannot rule and cannot be part of it. So this is the ramification of it, right? So this is what it means. For me as a historian, and I do not consider this text as sacred or the word of God, and looking at it critically, I love it. Because I realize this was written at 1,500 years ago. This is obviously by men who were male chauvinistic for their time. That's what everyone thought, and it's very human how they interact with women, how they interact with the world. What did they think of this? And you have to look at it in context. And in context, sometimes it's horrifying when they're talking about rape and how to deal with it. In part of really the pages that deal with that are awful. But when they're talking about, I don't know, concept of love, and when they're talking about sexuality, and it's very human to have like a window into 1,500 years ago, again, almost assuming that it doesn't have ramification over life, which unfortunately it does. But for a historical text, that's extremely interesting. By the way, everything I say is also true about the New Testament, right? And some faith tradition that look at some do not let your women teach in church, right? So and take that as something that you still have to keep nowadays. So this is very similar, and we're dealing with the same thing. And churches who, we just have a new pope and elected, and we have, women are not allowed to participate in that choice or serve in certain, Catholic traditions. So we have very similar struggles for the status of women in faith traditions.
Yes, right on this. There's a big tension there, especially doctrinal, regarding women and teaching in Christianity. Well, last words for Christian scholars. Don't be afraid to engage with Jewish writing. What would you say to them?
I have the same problem. I get scared by Christian texts. So first of all, I have a deal. Every time I meet a Christian scholar, I make a deal with them. I whisper in their eyes and say, every time you have a question about rabbinic Judaism, which you're embarrassed to ask me. And we have a deal. And I'll ask you if I have a question. I have some friends with New Testament that I ask all kinds of basic question that I'm worried. Because if we don't ask, we can't advance and we can't do any comparison study. If we each stay in where we feel comfortable, that's not gonna lead us very far. By the way, we live now in a very fortunate time when we have ChatGPT, so we don't have to be embarrassed. We can ask it, and it helps us. And we don't have to be embarrassed, and we're there. But I actually do believe very, very much in friendship and collegiality between scholars. And by the way, we kept talking about Jews and Christians in the ancient world. I want to talk about Jews and Christians in modern time. I just told you I came back from Bonn, and where I was teaching at the Protestant theology. The conversation around the table, every time I meet those scholars, I learn something new. And I love that the scholars have to interact, Jewish and Christian scholars as well. And lay people, Jews and Christians, have to interact, because this is the way we advance. And we can't be scared of our ignorance. I'll always be inferior in my knowledge of ancient Christianity to Christian scholars. Obviously, Alexander knows much more about New Testament and Acts than I do. And I guess I know more about Talmud than he does. But so what? It doesn't mean that I have to be scared. I just have to be friends with Alexander and be able to ask him questions when I want to, and study the text with him, and he can feel the same way about me. And this is how we advance. So in the interaction between faith and the study of different traditions or different religious traditions, I have to continue also in the study of those texts and not just in the texts themselves, because that's going to lead to intertextuality and interreligious dialogue in the scholarship as well.